And we'll go ahead and get started as it's now a few minutes after the hour. Want to welcome everyone to this Tuesday Io-Tahoe webinar, Data Catalogs, Mirror Registries, or Data Management Dynamos. A little bit of interrupted alliteration there, but hopefully that removes none of the enthusiasm. My name's Andrew Brust. I'm Io-Tahoe's Market Strategy Advisor and CEO of Blue Badge Insights. A little bit more about myself in just a second, but I'd also like to introduce our very special guest, and that's Joey D'Antoni. I'm here on our bio slide, and I'll just point out that Joey's been in this business a long time. He's with Denny Cherry Consultants now as a principal consultant. That's really only part of the story. Joey, I know that you've been in the data warehousing world for a long time, in the OLTP world for a long time. Maybe you could just fill us in on a little bit more than I'm able to provide.
Yeah, so my background, hi everyone, my background is strongly in databases, but I kind of evolved into doing infrastructure and big data architecture back in one of my last jobs for a major cable company on the East Coast. We did a lot of really interesting data projects there. Plus, as a consultant, I have lots of good word stories from other consulting engagements that we can talk about through this. Microsoft has recognized me, like Andrew, with the Data Platform MVP award for, I think, the 4th or 5th straight year.
Excellent. And well, Microsoft has its own stack of data products, including a data catalog, and that may come up in conversation briefly. But we're not really here to talk about specific brands. We're really here to talk about the category because, first of all, it's not new, but second of all, it has new relevance given a number of things, including all the data breaches and the headlines around that, and also the regulations that have kind of followed, including some very important regulation in Europe that I'm sure we'll get to. I'll just give you a tiny bit of background on myself. And by the way, Joey's joining us from, where exactly in Europe are you this morning? Or this afternoon?
Evening. Apeldoorn, Holland, at another fellow MVP's house.
All right. Well, he's got a good internet connection. That's good to know. Anyway, I cover big data and analytics for ZDNet as a blogger, but also for GigaOM as an analyst. I work directly with Io-Tahoe on their market strategy and making their product the best that it can be. And I've been focused on software development and all kinds of database work, really going all the way back to the mid-'80s when databases were, in my world at least, kind of flimsy little things that ran on individual PCs. So there's been quite a lot of change, I guess, in terms of the portfolio of technologies that I've gotten to use. In any case, we've really kind of got three sections here. We want to lay out some definitions, just level set, and make sure that when we're talking about data catalogs, we're all talking about the same thing, or really the same things, because it turns out to be a pretty broad category, and there are different, within it there are really different products and different subcategories. So we want to get that laid out. We want to talk about some of the challenges that exist to make data catalog work, comprehensive and effective. Not to say it can't be, but to say that not only do you need to want to make sure things are cataloged, you also have to be ready for the impediments to doing so, because that's what's going to get you to success at the end of the adventure in any case. And then we want to talk about a couple different approaches to data catalog work. So those are our three sections. Let's begin in earnest. And especially on webinars, I don't really like build slides, but for this one, rather than just kind of bombarding everyone with 5 bullets, we wanted to kind of go one at a time. So starting kind of from the simplest set of capabilities for a data catalog, Joey, we can start with the basic tenet of documentation.
The term data dictionary makes me feel really old because I remember that from my database classes when I was an undergraduate. But yeah, I think especially in a world where we have both self-service BI and NoSQL like Hadoop type databases at the same time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Having some basic definition of where all the data is really important.
At the very least, the lowest common denominator here is, well, I mean, the word says it all, is to catalog what you've got, what your databases are, and what's inside them in terms of tables and the columns in the tables. Or if we're talking about data lake technology, and by the way, data lake could be as sophisticated as a Hadoop or Spark cluster, or as unsophisticated, and I don't even mean to denigrate it, as just a bunch of flat files sitting in Amazon S3 or Azure Blob Storage or Google Cloud Storage. Any of those things can really constitute a database, and even there, a data lake, and even there we need to catalog things. Because in fact, you mentioned it already, in the world of self-service analytics, all that stuff is fair game for the folks who need to kind of crunch numbers and visualize data, wouldn't you say, Joey?
Yeah, for sure. We talk about service BI a lot, and in some ways I still think partially a myth because it has to be really curated for business users to be able to do it, and especially if you're talking about something like a data lake or even a data warehouse that maybe doesn't have a semantic layer in front of it. Those users have to have some rough idea, even if they're analysts who kind of know what they're doing of what they're querying.
Absolutely. And, we used to, and we'll probably have occasion to bring this term up one more time, but we used to jokingly refer to so-called spread marts, i.e. data marts living inside of spreadsheets, typically Excel spreadsheets. That hasn't really gone away, by the way, but that arguably was kind of the first instance of analysts kind of managing their own data in fairly raw form. But the whole point, I guess, of a spreadsheet is it's where the self-service folks may feel the most comfortable and the most empowered and the most in control. So we shouldn't neglect that, and what we should say is that all of it is part of your so-called data estate and is worthy of documentation and cataloging, if not actually more than worthy, actually, very much requiring it. If we go the next step in sophistication, though, we go beyond mere documentation. Now we have this idea about rules, business rules. Maybe you could talk about this since you're, like me, I think also from both the software development world as well as the database world. How do you kind of see these business rules in a data catalog working out?
So it's funny, it kind of ties back to the data dictionary term. I like to think of them as being defined there, so that an analyst might have understanding, if there's for example, a report that's covering gross margin or profit margin, or a set of data that would lead you to that report, how that is calculated and what the rules are in place and what the timings are for things like financial quarters in terms of date dimensions and things like that. This goes kind of beyond just the raw data that we're storing and talking about some of the logic that is implemented. You may even go as far as to talk about divisional breakdowns and how things are broken down within a given organization.
And I guess that cable company you mentioned had a lot of different business units within it, right? And yeah. So, go ahead.
Yeah, and they all had purchasing autonomy, which made this all the more fun. In that scenario, we didn't have a common repository, so there were always differing definitions. and that was just, and we'll talk about it on the slide later, but in our IT organization, that led to different definitions of things like uptime, right? Or various IT reporting metrics, because kind of one of my main jobs there was to be the data warehouse architect for like our IT database, so, or not database, databases. So assemble all that together into one giant data warehouse and try to report on it. And not having a common set of business rules means you have people arguing about stuff.
Right. So I guess we're already kind of telegraphing here the fact that catalogs are necessary, but they have to be managed carefully or they can actually create additional complexity, the very same complexity that maybe they seek to eliminate. Beyond rules, though, there's also just the notion of having more friendly definitions and descriptions of what is in a company's whole kind of data corpus or estate. And we shouldn't, I don't know, it sounds a little trivial, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this, because this is actually what makes data discoverable and usable, and ultimately is the enabler of whether a business is going to be data-driven, you know, in terms of enthusiasm or not.
I don't know. I don't know if you've ever gone to an SAP and seen the column and table names, but if you did, or JD Edwards for another example, not to pick on SAP, they're absolutely meaningless identifiers. They may as well all be GUIDs. They're not GUIDs, but they may as well be. You can't present something like that to even an analyst who's really IT savvy. They're not going to have the first inkling of how to build a report. And this kind of ties back into what we've been talking about with semantic modeling and self-service BI. But this data catalog gives us a place to store that information in conjunction to maybe a tabular layer or an in-memory layer, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
All right. And then let me build out the rest of the slide here if I can. Actually, we kind of touched on this idea of just kind of making things more discoverable and friendly. But one of the jobs of a data catalog, and it kind of depends on the product and it kind of depends on the customer, but one of the jobs of the data catalog is really to evangelize the data lake or the data warehouse, and really get it so that people can sit down to do analytics and maybe flip this 80-20 rule about how much time they spend searching for the data and puzzling through the data versus analyzing it. You know, maybe they can make the bigger number the amount of time that they're spending analyzing it. In any case, I want to ask you what you think of this, because I've been saying it for years, at the risk of using a word that itself sounds a little soft. The process of doing analytics on data, I think there needs to be a component of fun in it, or adoption is low. I mean, what do you think? I'm a little bit in the armchair when I say that. You're more in the trenches. So
I've seen a lot of IT organizations implement data warehouses, or even a business implement a data warehouse, because most commonly it's a business-driven project, and you know, they bring in a team of highly paid consultants, which I'm thankful for, and we do a good job of getting all their data from their source systems and building it into pick your data analysis framework. There are a few different patterns you can use. And then ultimately, when they have their visualization layer, whatever that is, we go back and look at the analytics of who's using that. And, you know, it's like 10 users in IT that are running all the reports, and it's not going out to the business. It has to be manageable so that business users, if you really want to have self-service BI, it has to be easy for users to kind of engage. And I've seen that in some organizations where it's very easy for users to consume data because they do have things like well-defined catalogs and knowledge bases, and probably most importantly is that taxonomy. And I think definitions and descriptions are probably the two things that I feel are the most key there, just because developers don't always make table names pretty.
No, not at all. And that's true even in a warehouse, and certainly in a data lake. And you mentioned ERP applications. I mean, those kind of have some of their roots, or the architects of those applications have some of their roots in the mainframe world, where the names almost had to be cryptic because there were limitations on the number of characters in the names, and everything was capital letters. We've come a long way, but that doesn't mean all of the older cultural tendencies have gone away. So if stuff's not fun, I mean, it's good. You do minimally need to catalog and map everything, and even if you haven't made it really super discoverable and usable, that's an important mission. But if you really want your organization to be data-driven, you have to make it so that the people doing the work can actually enjoy it to an extent. It's not that it's going to be leisurely; it's still work, but it's gotta have an element to it where people can feel confident in their abilities. And so great. Now we've laid down some definitions, but let's also recognize, as I said before, that catalogs are not monolithic. They're not uniform in what they do. Would you mind terribly just kind of talking through each of the four kinds of workloads that we've laid out on this slide, Joey?
Yeah, no problem. The first bit is discoverability, and this is kind of a lot of what we were talking about on the last slide. And that's so when you have a data warehouse or a data lake or a Hadoop cluster, or however you have your data prepared for analytics, you want to make it so that your end users and your business, your end users are always your business users. Obviously, unless you're building an IT data warehouse like I did in the past, you want to make sure that it's easy for business users to be able to go in and get the components they need to make things like sales projections or based on a sales report. And yes, some of those are canned reports that you might deliver, but if you want them to take that next step and start to work on things like some analytics, or you have a data science team on hand, you don't want them to have to spend like Andrew mentioned, 80-20 rule, which is 80% data preparation, 20% data science. You'd like to see that shift more towards, a 50-50 at best model.
Right.
So that's the discoverability piece. Governance, I kind of like to tie back to when I worked for a large Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company that no longer exists. They were acquired by another large Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company. And I worked in manufacturing there, and I supported data at the plant effectively, and data for a few plants. And what I saw there was kind of interesting because we talk about shadow IT a lot, especially in a cloud computing world. And there was a vast array of shadow IT of people, using Excel and in worst cases Access. Because the nice thing about an Excel spreadsheet is it's really user people build Access applications, and you have all this data that's not manageable, not backed up correctly. All sorts of problems there. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm still here. The audio on your side, I think, was a little choppy when you were talking about spreadsheets, but you kind of came back, so I think we're good.
Okay,
you can
cool.
Keep going. Yeah. Are you on?
Yeah.
Or past governance? I think you ought to maybe mention GDPR, given where you're sitting.
Yeah, and this is going to tie into both governance and data classification. If you've been asleep for the last 3 months, towards the end of May, the European Union implemented, after a long multi-year process, GDPR, which is General Data Protection Rules, I think.
Regulation,
yes. Regulation, thank you. And it's why I can't read just about any U.S. newspaper site from my current location without jumping through a VPN. this is a very, very nebulous set of rules, but in general is I think a good thing that gives individual users data privacy. And most importantly, into this governance and data classification piece, is it gives users the right to be forgotten. So you have to have some sort of process to delete a user who wants to be forgotten by your system, and that's a key component of a catalog for governance, right? Because you can have, where all that user information is. There's some bit of controversy about how this works in regards to backups. Typically, the assumption is it's fine that if a user's information is on your backup file, as long as you have a method like maybe having a hash token to delete that user's record once that gets restored. That's a kind of another commonplace. That leads us into data classification, and these two things tie kind of hand in hand. This is an area I know Microsoft has made some recent investments in their SQL data warehouse or SQL database and in some of their tooling for some of their products to start kind of going in and doing data analysis, data classification. For example, they'll warn you if you have columns like social security number that are unencrypted. And this may be where you want to classify data via departments, but it may also be where you want to classify data in terms of privacy and those sorts of regulatory issues. I know back in my healthcare days, that sort of data privacy, especially any sort of system where you're dealing with patient level data, is really critical. Finally, one other purpose that we see master data data catalog serve is serving as a master data management solution. I know this was I worked on a project at another medical company I worked for where we were moving ERP systems. So we were switching from JD Edwards to SAP. And a big part of that was trying to analyze our master data and build a master data list. And we had some major problems there and just challenges in terms of the data set and the master data, the actual master data we had, because it's a company that made internal and external fixation devices. That means like if you break a bone, the plate or screw that is used to fix that bone was made by this company. And the problems we had there were mainly just about the sheer number of SKUs they have, or stock keeping unit, I should say, which is just an individual item, just because of the custom nature of their business. And we also, in that place, had a kind of a unique situation where we had lots of inventory that was deployed to our field sales reps. That ties back into a little bit of the master data, because we wanted inventory as part of master data, and it was really hard to keep track of, but just because of the way the business rules around inventory were.
Can I also call out something and one belated housekeeping note? So the belated housekeeping note is that if people have comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. We're keeping an eye on that, and we'd love to just incorporate your questions. If you are in the live audience, we'd love to incorporate your questions in the conversation here. And then, Joey, the thing I wanted to call out is I've seen the industry get a little sloppy and take master data management, turn it into a 3-letter acronym of MDM, and then some companies take MDM and overload it and refer to it as metadata management. And maybe you could help illuminate why those two things are not the same.
So, personal opinion and my experience, the way I treat master data is that's the master reference data for the company, and that's the single source. If you're doing master data management properly, that system becomes the single source of truth for things like customers, suppliers, products, anything. It's a lot of things that are probably slowly changing dimensions if we think about it from a data warehouse modeling perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a pretty close correlation between master data and dimension data,
yeah.
Although they're not exactly the same thing either, but that's a lot closer. Master data and dimensions are a lot closer together than master data and metadata.
Yeah, metadata is, man, metadata is, especially in light of various things. Metadata is kind of a loaded term. It's what we're really defining. Back in my old days as a DBA, I always just thought of metadata being the data about the system, right? Like, for example, relational databases log a whole bunch of stuff. So all that was what I considered metadata. Ironically, I kind of built a data warehouse.
And that kind of thing.
Yeah, ironically, I kind of built a data warehouse out of system metadata at Comcast, but that's not truly, in my opinion, master data, because and that's speaking specifically to IT system data, but obviously you're going to have business metadata as well, but those aren't the same things, because I feel like your metadata definitions can change much more rapidly over time than your master data can.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
One is data about the data. The other is actual data, although, data of a certain kind of primary importance. Okay. We're good on definitions, I think, and now we want to move on to some challenges. We're about halfway through our time, and that's fine that we spent the first half kind of laying down the groundwork. Let's talk about some of the things that make data cataloging. Although it's a laudable goal, actually it's more than laudable. It really is necessary to try and get to the point where everything is cataloged. That's going to be hard though. So, you're going to start with the stuff that's fairly well known and fairly well exposed. That's going to be your data warehouses. If you're a BI customer, maybe you've got OLAP cubes, or maybe, I don't know, maybe OLAP cube sounds too old-fashioned for you, and so you just want to call them BI models. Really, they're the same thing. They're models that define dimensions and measures, and those are, in effect, the drill-down categories and the numbers you want to drill down, respectively. So you've got warehouses, you've got cubes, and you've got data lakes. And I think we've already talked about how data lake, it's a neat term, but it can describe a broad variety of things, including a bunch of flat files, sitting in cloud storage or some kind of clustered storage. Fine. But that's, data lakes are newfangled. What about the old-fangled problems of proliferation of data around the organization? Tell us about these two bubbles on the left and the right.
We've alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think especially as you go into larger, more distributed organizations, you see this problem. But I just like to always assume that all the fancy work I do when architecting a data warehouse, OLAP cube, or data lake, it's going to end up in, even if I do my job correctly, some business user is going to have that data stored off in his or her own Excel spreadsheet. That's probably stored on a file server if I'm lucky. But Excel and I'll throw a shout out to Google Sheets are probably still, even in light of some of the great business intelligence tools that are on the market today, are still some of the most commonly used tools amongst finance analysts. I actually got a feature request, and I don't work for Microsoft, but somebody asked me to pass it along, that their analysts wanted VBA implemented in Power BI because they do so much VBA in their Excel spreadsheets.
VBA is Visual Basic for Applications, the long-standing scripting language inside of Excel and actually inside of Access as well.
Yeah. So you're always going to have this proliferation. It's very easy to connect the data using Excel and Access. It's funny, Andrew and I were prepping for this call last week, and we were talking about Access, and I honestly hadn't seen an Access database in probably 5 years. And I've just started working with a new customer recently who's using SQL Server as a backend, but they've built a pretty nice front end to their credit using Access. In more cases, when I saw it in my past was when I was in divisions of organizations, and there was a lack of application or lack of reports built around a business need, so that business users would need a report. They'd maybe have a small IT organization on site at a manufacturing where they'd have somebody who's like kind of a quote unquote developer, not necessarily like a full-on developer that you'd think of, but they would use VBA and build application and business logic into Access. And this becomes a little.
I think business units are going to use the tools that they know and the tools that they're able to harness, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that's changed, I guess, is it's business isn't such a PC laden kind of organization anymore. So as you said, it's not all about Excel. A lot of stuff happens in Google Sheets, and I suppose a lot of the stuff that lived in desktop databases like Access, that could be in a whole number of web browser based and software as a service based tools as well. But first of all, the phenomenon from before of stuff in desktop tools is still there, and second of all, the new sort of incarnation of that really isn't any different. So, whether we call this rogue or we call it distributed or we call it I don't know, unmonitored or autonomous, what? Do you have any sage words? I'm totally putting you on the spot, but do you have any sage words about how to get that in the catalog too?
There are some really monitoring tools that will show you ad services. Not only halfway kidding.
I may need you to repeat
honestly,
that.
The cloud's a little bit.
The audio got a little garbled there.
Okay. There are a number of network monitoring tools that will let you look at for cloud services. And I say that only halfway kidding, especially from an IT perspective. There's just a governance concern there. Data stored in Access databases and Excel spreadsheets is kind of equally a governance concern, but it's on-prem, and you can kind of monitor it for that by looking at file servers and such. But if you have a business unit who just decides to start using Dynamo to store some data or starts their own Redshift project that you don't know about, you don't know how that data is managed. And it's nice to have those talks. And this pretty much comes straight down to a we don't want to go to jail or get fined perspective. So that's the first part of that, is you want to ensure that your data is not breached. The second part of that...
Just to clarify, DynamoDB is Amazon Web Services sort of NoSQL database, and Redshift is their cloud-based data warehouse.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, you just want to make sure that your business users aren't going completely rogue and off the grid without any sort of intervention, because that's the whole going to jail or having a data breach issue. Back to the matter at hand, though, we talked about data catalogs. It's nice if you know where that data is going, and frankly, it's probably coming from some combination of your on-prem data and business logic. This is not an IT problem, building a data catalog. It's an IT working with business problem, and those two units have to work together to effectively build the data catalog. You just have to know what's out there. This isn't the point where you probably want to not tell the business bad things because they're using a desktop database or a spreadsheet to do some of their analysis. You just want to kind of go forward and catalog everything they have and know what's out there so you can do your best to protect it and that sort of thing. And if you're a data steward or in data governance, you want to kind of understand what decisions are being made off that data and if it's good or not.
Yeah, one tricky thing, and this really kind of this sort of transcends technology generations and waves, and that is that there are tools out there to help transform the data within the process of analyzing it, and those are very helpful tools. What people don't necessarily realize is that those tools that are used to transform the data while it's ephemeral end up being repositories themselves for data that ends up being more permanent. So, and that's really where something like an Access or an Excel or any of the data preparation tools that exist out there, they look like they're just there to manipulate. Well, manipulate's a bad word, but to reshape the data to kind of help it while it's in process, in motion. But they also end up being databases in their own right. And everyone needs to kind of, I don't know, I feel like we need to raise awareness around that tools that look like they have a temporary lifespan or involvement actually have more permanence than we may realize. And that's where some of this leakage happens.
Yeah, and like I say, most of my observations of that have been and kind of ties into the slide a bit, ties into decentralized parts of organizations where, you know, they're maybe not getting the attention and love from the IT organization to deliver the systems they need. And I don't want to say they go rogue, they just need to meet their business needs, and they need a system for record keeping.
Yep. And anyway, like I said, you know, some of the consequences are unintended. Actually, a lot of them are. But let's speak to this slide, and if we do it quickly, that's okay. But you know, there's two sides to the data catalog coin. You know, one is absolute necessity and mandate. You need to document. You need to make things discoverable. If you're using a data catalog correctly, you're also going to use it as a tool to help you find and eliminate redundant data and just get everything a lot more clean and organized. And also, you know, use it if you can as a tool to kind of help monitor which data sets are more popular, which ones are being used when and by whom, and so forth. But a lot of the products out there, without naming names, are a little bit based on, gosh, what's the best word for this? There is kind of an honor system element to a lot of these products, where, you know, it's kind of open to a broad set of users, and it's not necessarily the case that the stuff that goes into a catalog is vetted. Some catalog products do have workflow around them, so that entries that are put in there have to go through an approval process, and you know, that's very important. Others are a little bit more, you know, we're just giving you, it's the art of the possible, without a lot of audit and control around it. And if you're going to use a product like that, you probably have to put in a lot of manual effort to maintain the quality of what's been put in there. So just as data transformation tools can have the unintended consequence of becoming additional repositories, data catalogs can have the unintended consequence of inaccuracy and or redundancy themselves. And in fact, we had a couple of use cases to talk about, and these are really things that resulted in my kind of interviewing you for this webinar. But in the first case, we had, I guess, a pretty simple, like, I don't mean simple in an unsophisticated way, just a modest goal of using Microsoft's cloud product called Azure Data Catalog, just to set up a searchable inventory of the data sets in the enterprise.
Yeah, so this company is one of my long-term clients, and I work with them a ton. I was actually up at 3 a.m. doing a database restore last night. But they enrich publicly available real estate data with some logic and analytics. And one of the things they did to try to take advantage of making BI more self-service was to use Azure Data Catalog, which is Microsoft's cloud service, like Andrew mentioned. And this is mainly just kind of a metadata tagging tool that allowed their developers and analysts to kind of better see that data. However, even some of the caveats to this were interesting, because one of the products they're working on is a data as a service function. Right now, their customers receive data in just about any sort of format you can think of, flat files, CSVs, whatever. And they don't really have intelligence built into that data to make it easy for their customers to search. And one of the kind of interesting limitations of this is as they're moving to a platform where they're giving each of their customers a cloud database to work with, we wanted to implement Azure Data Catalog there because it just made all sorts of sense. The problem we had is that the security for Data Catalog is set at the subscription level, and that's the only way to set it. So we were limited by that because the users would have had read-write into the catalog. So, and we can only have one per Azure subscription. So what we ended up doing was exporting the data out of the catalog. It's like all modern systems. It's in JSON format. And we were able to add that metadata into the database to kind of give them a catalog within their database, which is a little confusing, but it worked for what we were trying to do.
All right, so it sounds like you started with a mission with a fairly limited scope, a tool with fairly limited capabilities, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And in a way, you know, I went to a Quaker college, and part of the Quaker ethic is that small is beautiful, and I think that's true a lot of the time. So by keeping it small, it sounds like you ended up with something pretty effective. Even there, though, you had challenges. Now shift that over to the cable company where you worked, and you mentioned earlier that individual business units had their own, their right to kind of procure individually, to do their own purchasing. And here you ended up with multiple data catalogs being used.
So
before I ask you what chaos ensued from that, can you tell us, were there any upsides to that? And I mean, I'm not being facetious.
Other than being able to list on my resume that I had used all these various tools.
Well, that's one upside, sure.
Not tremendously, because you had different departments and different standards. The only thing I'll say is that organization was big enough that having all those tools within the business units wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The having three within IT was a problem. It did mean each business unit could choose the tool set you wanted to work with. However, when it comes to things like master data for reporting or you know, trying to line up common business definitions, and I think that's really, with this company, the thing I think most of is having all these arguments about what something meant, because you don't have a clearly defined set of business rules around data analysis. Different systems had different definitions. Not that this was the case, but for example, you could have profit margin defined three different ways by three different parts of the organization. That made it really challenging. The other thing that made it really challenging is just unifying all that data. So we almost, as somebody who worked kind of at high level IT in this organization, we almost had to do ETL from the 5 different data warehouses in the company to bring together one kind of master data warehouse. And this is something you'll see at very large enterprises where you end up having everything. I think this company is on just about every vendor's slide of that we're a customer of or this company is a customer of this vendor. So you see that a lot. My challenges in IT were, like I mentioned earlier, my job was really managing IT data and metadata and showing things like data center utilization and capacity and things like that. Not having everybody on the same page and having a standard set of business rules murdered that made it really hard. If you've ever tried to come up with costing in a data center for what a compute node costs, it's really challenging, and it's really challenging by itself. It's extremely challenging when you have 4 different business units involved, and they each have their own definitions and set of rules around that. Andrew?
Sorry about that. I got to believe there's some upside in that giving folks exposure to the power of a data catalog, and maybe even getting them into the place where they make some mistakes gets them kind of ready to do things in a more holistic fashion, subsequently. So maybe the best thing initially for an organization that hasn't really invested in data catalog technology is to pilot or trial stuff, get proverbial feet wet, and start really mapping out what all these tools can bring, so that you can also kind of keep a list of what the best of all the worlds is, and then use that list as criteria for a more permanent implementation. But it's also pretty clear that, just like everything else, there's unintended consequences, and you have to be kind of mindful of the fact that things that start out with certain intentions can have ramifications, and you just need to be ready for that. So transformation tools become additional repositories. Multiple catalogs can actually end up creating conflicting definitions, and as you mentioned, there can even be multiple data warehouses that need to be synthesized into sort of a mother of all data warehouses. So just it's best to proceed with eyes wide open to some of this stuff. What I don't want to do here is give people a kind of sinking feeling that they're sort of doomed to an ineffective implementation. Rather, what I'm hoping we can do is give people the benefit of hindsight here, maybe before they get started. And especially because if they encounter some of these speed bumps, maybe they won't feel discouraged because they know it's part of the process. But it's so important. Data has always been the lifeblood of computing and systems, but it is so much more so now with all the analytics tools and all the hype and excitement around analytics and AI. It's just something that has to be taken super, super seriously. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Your data is your business value.
Yep. In lots of different ways, right? It can be monetized, it can be kept private and used for competitive advantage, and the flip side of it is if it's not well managed, it can cause negative value. It can impact value negatively. So, like I said, I don't want folks to leave with the notion that this is futile, because it's not. There's definitely use cases where companies have implemented data catalog technology and done really well, gone away with important return on investment wins, and really felt kind of stoked and validated for endeavoring to get this done. The thing is that if you're going to do everything manually in terms of cataloging, there is a certain futility to that, because getting it done right for just one repository is time consuming. And then you got to move on to the next one and the next one. And I think in the case of most organizations, the velocity at which you get stuff cataloged is lower than the velocity at which repositories are multiplying. So, you don't want to rush, but on the other hand, you definitely don't want to rush. But on the other hand, when you finish stuff and you move on to the next, you may have a bigger backlog than when you started. And the thing that drives me crazy in the industry is that we always talk about, we extol the virtues of analytics and AI, and that's how we justify doing all this kind of, housekeeping work, if you will. But somehow we don't put two and two together and say that the magic of analytics and AI can also apply to the very effort of managing the data in the first place. We can use AI to manage AI. We can use AI to manage analytics. And so does all the cataloging work have to be manual? Or is there some combination of manual and automated that can be put into play? Let's start on the left side of the slide, though. Probably what you want to do, if possible, is open up the data cataloging work so that business users can participate, so that in effect you can crowdsource the collection of tribal knowledge. And a nice side effect of that is you can also end up getting business user buy-in into the analytics efforts as you do that. If there are the workflows and audit controls around that process, that can work pretty well. But I don't know, Joey, what's your opinion in terms of how comprehensive that can be and how accurate it can be? I mean, certainly without business users, there's going to be inaccuracies. But with business users, does that create potential for other inaccuracies?
The one time I really get directly involved with this was in this particular kind of crowdsourcing effort was when I took part at the medical device company on that ERP project I mentioned earlier. And we kind of had a 3-day kickoff with all the key business users, and it wasn't just managers, it was like kind of the people who actually kept the organization running. And we did a really good job, and it was a lot of effort of gathering data rules and master data, and then the project just went to hell from there. But that was a different story. But the capturing of that data was really good, and that was about the largest organization I would imagine doing that in, because it was a few thousand-person company that did about $4 billion a year in sales. In an enterprise, that's going to be a challenge. You might be able to pull that off within an organization or a division of a enterprise, but at large enterprise scale, you're not going to be able to crowdsource your entire data estate across the enterprise. And no matter what you do, I think you're always going to miss out on a percentage of it, and that's fine, right? It's having that definition of what you care about, but you're definitely going to miss some things.
So, but why not sort of capture the human knowledge, which, you know, at the end of the day is going to be the most sophisticated, and then combine that with machine learning so that you can kind of catch up with that velocity problem that I mentioned.
Yeah,
way,
I mean,
go ahead.
That's you don't want to have this driven by an IT organization who 100% just runs an auto discovery tool and says, this is our data catalog, business users start using it. You need to have domain experts involved in the process, in addition to some machine learning to really help with that.
The expertise has to be seeded by humans because they're the ones with the expertise. The process then of extrapolating that over additional repositories over and over ad nauseum, that's actually, there are large elements of that end up being a tedious task, and machines are great for tedious tasks. Even if it's more kind of about intelligence than algorithmic approach, I mean, that's what AI is about. We can automate these things. Even there, though, what we don't want to do is just delegate everything away to the machines. We still want the domain experts to be able to monitor what the machines found and then validate it. But it's a lot easier to validate what's being brought to you than have to do all that legwork yourself. So that really ends up being a pretty nuanced and sophisticated approach. Let's take what so many of these crowdsourced products can do. Let's bring AI, and by AI we don't, by the way, just mean machine learning. We also mean natural language processing. We also mean deep learning, and that's why AI is probably the better term. And let's see if we can't put those things together. And the other great thing about AI is that the models start out with a certain level of accuracy, but if it's managed correctly, the accuracy keeps increasing. Because in effect what you're doing is, you know, you're training. And that's probably going to be the optimistic note here, is that we now have the technology to harness machines' processing abilities to scale ourselves, not to replace ourselves. So an awful lot of doomsaying around AI. It's hard to imagine machines really replace people, but machines have always been able to make people more productive and, take what people can do manually and replicate it at a faster pace than people could or would want to on their own. So this is still a new area in data cataloging, and the one kind of pluggy thing I'll do in this Io-Tahoe webinar is to mention that Io-Tahoe, while not a data catalog product exclusively, it has a very at its core a very sophisticated data catalog capability, and it's absolutely based on that notion of discovery. And also the other things that Io-Tahoe does in terms of discovering relationships within databases and data flows between databases and data lakes, that gets brought to bear as well. So all these things become axes of extrapolating what is at first collected in a more intimate way with individual domain experts. So that must have had something to do with why Gartner gave Io-Tahoe cool vendor status last year. And at that point, the catalog was not even a ready for prime time part of the product, but at this point it is. So that's as salesy as I want to get here, and even if I wanted to get more so, we're at the top of the hour. So at this point, Joey, I'm gonna say thank you so much for joining us and lending not just your opinions and your wisdom, but also some of the anecdotes from the projects you've worked on and the customers you've worked with. I'll ask you for any parting words, if you had any other thoughts that I might have squelched out, and otherwise we'll kind of close things up.
No, just thanks everyone, and however you do it, it's always good to catalog your data, just to know what you have and know where you're building reports. And this is something that should involve your business, and it should probably involve your IT organization as well. It's a joint project, but it's never a bad thing to do.
Absolutely. There's so many things that involve data where that IT and business partnership has to come about. I was involved in a study, a paper, and a webinar for another organization where we were talking about that with respect to Internet of Things, IoT. It just seems like that theme repeats over and over and over. But in the case of data catalog, it's such a core central thing that applies to IoT and so many other domains that it's super important right there. In any case, we want to thank our live audience, and for anyone listening to this recording, we want to thank you for taking your time. A linear hour is an awful lot of commitment, and we want to thank everyone. And Joe, since it's late over there in the Netherlands where you are, I'll say good evening, and I want to thank everyone very much. Take care. We'll see you on the next webinar.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.
All right. Bye.